Well, non-governmental organizations, Reporters Without Borders, is calling for international law to be respected and for the protection of journalists reporting from conflict zones. At least 10 members of the media have been killed in the over week-long fighting between Israel and Palestine. We're joined by Wits University Caxton Professor of Journalism, Anton Harber. Anton, it's very difficult to see what is coming out of the Middle East and this conflict currently, but one certainly becomes even more worried when we see the way in which journalists, their bodies, have been caught in the line of fire.
Yes, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists is now reporting that 11 journalists have died, 9 of them Palestinian, 1 Lebanese, 1 Israeli, and there's 1 Israeli who appears to have been taken hostage, 1 Israeli photographer. So it's a really tough situation for journalists. It requires incredible courage and strength to cover it, because not only is it incredibly dangerous and chaotic, but you've got journalists on both sides dealing with their own safety and the safety of their families and friends while they're trying to report. So it's an incredibly stressful and difficult time for journalists. But let me emphasize how important that work is, because we've seen on social media there's been a flood of disinformation. Some of it quite purposeful and malicious, spreading untruths about both sides of the conflict. And so having journalists who are able to give proper, verified, trustworthy information is absolutely so critical, and yet so difficult.
And part of what we're seeing out of this conflict really is that some of the fault lines, Anton, around how we see credibility, particularly across media today, that has come into question, right? Because there are some news outlets or organizations that are perceived to have a particular slant in their reporting, and that, of course, is also influencing how the journalists of those media houses are also being dealt with and treated on the ground. Now, what is it really? What is the role that news organizations can play in the height of conflict to still ensure that that profession, our profession, is protected?
Well, it should be to get out the facts of the case, the facts of the situation. It should be to give a true picture of what's happening. But of course, it's very hard to do it with any sense of non-partisanship or neutrality in a situation where one's family and one's friends and oneself is under such extraordinary threat on both sides. So it's extremely difficult. I know that if I'm watching television, for example, I'm watching the international channels, the only way to try and get a reasonable picture is to move between different ones with different points of view. So I flick between Al Jazeera and CNN, for example, or BBC, in the hope that between them I can find some balance.
Do you think it would be fair to close bureaus or hubs of any of those entities simply because one may not necessarily agree with how they're covering the conflict?
No, I don't think so. I think we absolutely have to do what we can to protect journalists and let them carry on their work. Of course, their safety is paramount, and steps really need to be taken to protect journalists. Gaza has been one of the most dangerous places for journalists, claimed many lives of journalists in the last decade. We really have to try and get both sides to respect the role and position of the media. And while we have to protect them, we really have to urge that they stick with their job and do the best they can, and certainly be allowed to do so.
You know, Anton, when we look again at what's happening in this conflict, often as a journalist, when you're covering a story, particularly in conflict situation, there is a point at which you can and you will be pulled out simply because it's become too dangerous. Now, many journalists in this instance are forced into the conflict simply because that's where the story is. Do you think that at some point news organizations are going to have to make a call about whether or not they have representatives out there, simply because of how dangerous it is? I mean, we've seen journalists who, during their crossings, are hearing shelling, are seeing rockets flying over their head, and there's genuine fear and anxiety in their reporting.
There is, and news organizations, they will never pull out completely, but they'll certainly have to pull back and get their journalists to safe places when they are under threat, because clearly the first thing they've got to do is look after the safety of their people. But at the same time, they have to do the coverage as fully and as best and as accurately as possible. It requires extraordinary courage, but it really also requires all the parties to the conflict to respect the role and position of journalists.
Do you believe that the risks that the industry is taking are a little bit further than what perhaps has been done traditionally, particularly because we have all of this new technology that has come into play? We're able to see live visuals of the situation in Gaza, in Sadat, in Jerusalem, and there's obviously a contest, to get eyes watching, and that's really the aim of many channels. But do you think it's pushing those boundaries a bit more?
Well, I think many of the lives that have been lost have been because journalists have found themselves caught in the situation without time or space to think about whether this is a safe place to be. So I think the Israelis on the first attack, journalists who were in that area just found themselves caught up in it like all citizens and others. And Palestinians in Gaza are finding themselves under attack, facing the rockets and the bombs, just like any other citizen. And it's not as if they've had much choice to get out of it. So it hasn't been a question of choice. And that's why there's been so many lives lost. But I do want to say that although it's important to have eyes on, these days you can do a great deal with satellites, with social media, if you verify and treat it carefully. And so, for example, some of the most accurate reporting from the Ukraine has come from careful analysis of visual data, such as satellite and videos, as long as they're very carefully verified and checked.
All right. Professor of Journalism, Anton Harber, he's with Wits University. Thanks for your time tonight, Anton.